All right, good morning. If you're following along in the syllabus, you'll notice that this is out of order. We actually were supposed to be doing cyberspace law today, but we'll catch that either Friday or Monday. The test that is scheduled for Monday, I'm going to push into the middle of next week so that you guys don't have to spend your first weekend back studying for a test. So that'll be sometime mid next week. All right. And we'll talk about what it covers probably on Monday. Today we're going to talk about the story of television, as you can see on the screen here. But before we get to television, let's talk a little bit about photography, which is, of course, where television sort of originated. Photography, of course, the idea of putting light in graphic form. It comes from the Greek photos, and the Greek word graphe. Photos, of course, means light, and this, of course, means graph. You'll recognize those from a lot of things we use those words for, like many of our words. Greek is the origin of a lot of our language, about 40 or 50% of it. So photos and graphe, meaning to put light into graphic form. Photography as an art form, as a concept, has probably been around since the early to mid 1800s. People started talking about it. People started using the word photography in that period of time. The first cameras, as we know them, probably didn't occur until 40 or 50 years after that period of time. But photography as a concept, and as you'll see in this lecture, the idea of photosensitive materials began to emerge. Photography, of course, is silver halide particles embedded in an emulsion that's painted onto a photo or a film base of some sort, usually either cellulose or acetate of some sort. So that concept is the origin of television, the idea. And once we started thinking about the concept of taking light, impressing a sensitive chemical or element, changing its properties, and putting that image into graphic form, then we started thinking about moving images. And then once we started thinking about moving images, the process continued logically. How could you, if you could, transmit those moving images in some format? So that gets us to our story of television. So television evolved out of the film production industry. And the film production industry sort of grew up around the same time as photography. And we'll talk more about film production in some later lectures. So naturally, there are a number of similarities between the two art forms, but there are a lot of significant differences as well. One of the earliest forms of moving pictures was an apparatus known as the mutoscope, a hand-cranked peep show viewed by peeping through a small hole and turning a crank, as you can see here. And you produce the moving images, which were literally on paper. They were much like the little things you played with as kids, where you thumbed through and made the little man run or made images move. The mutoscope was based on the same principle. The film production as we know it probably originated with a guy named Thomas Edison, whom I'm sure you've heard of, who invented the film camera later in the 19th century. So this was a huge phenomenon. As I said, people were talking about this. Scientists were thinking about it. How can we do this? How can we make a picture that moves? Thomas Edison, the first to put it all together. This is one of the earliest moving pictures. This media is not linked here. I'd show you the picture. It's about 2 seconds long, and it's a picture of people dancing around in their outside of their parlor in England, as you can read there. You can search that on the internet if you want to watch that video. It was October 14th, 1888. So that's the first extant film we have of anything. By today's standard, of course, they were very crude. There's no sound, usually no storyline. It would be a number of years before people started putting storylines to moving pictures. Then they would start adding scripts. They would storyboard their films, and more of the traditional things that we, at that time, that they would see in live theater, more of the things that we know of in movies today. The early equipment was light. Unlike what would ultimately evolve, the early equipment was light enough to be carried around and transported virtually anywhere. As you saw in the first film, they were outside their parlor dancing. Outside was easy. Outside sets were cheap. You didn't have to build anything. You didn't have to produce anything. You just had to make up a story along the lines of the outside set. So that was much easier. So that's how the early films came into being. You didn't have to have much permission. Remember, when we're talking about licensing, as we are in entertainment law, sometimes you might have to get permission to use an indoor set. But indoor sets ultimately came about. People started wanting to film things that were indoor related, and they would build those in warehouses, cheap property. When motion picture productions started migrating to Southern California, we would, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about film studios, warehouses were popular. The weather was year-round, comfortable. So this was an ideal location. You could find cheap space out in the orange groves, and the weather cooperated most of the time. So this attracted a lot of film production, and ultimately, of course, became Hollywood, the golden era being from 1930 to 1960. The mechanics of television evolved along this same time. As I said, we started using the word photography in the 1830s, approximately. We started talking about mechanics of sending those moving images that we thought about over airwaves later, about 50 years, in the 1880s. 1873 is one of the noted dates of television because the photoconductive properties of selenium were discovered at that point in time. Selenium's electrical conduction varies with the amount of illumination it receives. Much like silver halide, parts of it turns black or different shades of gray as you expose light to it, and depending upon how much light you expose to it. This is a name I want you to remember. 23-year-old German engineering student Paul Nipkow proposed and patented the world's first mechanical television system in 1884. Nipkow devised the notion of dissecting the image and transmitting it sequentially. To do this, he designed the first spinning disc that would be incorporated in these devices to project the image. He created this Nipkow disc, it's called, and this is the actual patent drawing for the disc. So this would analyze and rapidly rotate between the scene and the sensitive element. Because at that time, photography was moving along the same lines. We had a pinpoint hole that would project the image onto silver halide. With television, the moving disc was required. At that point in time, the image had a remarkable resolution of 18 lines. As a point of comparison, of course, we have thousands of lines now. Other inventors continued to develop this disc through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. But again, resolution very low. It wouldn't be until 1930, however, until we start seeing the first mass-produced televisions, 1930. And that was in the form of Baird in the UK. They produced the first ones. But the image on those were postage size images. This is actually the screen right here. So you really had to get close to look at it and see it. Now in 1920, at the same time, radio was coming into its own as an art form, as a medium. In the 1920s, people would sit around the radios and listen to stories, listen to people acting out stories or reading stories. Westerns, playhouses, comedies. So the first television stations sort of evolved along those same lines. In fact, they incorporated the radio broadcast into the television broadcast. They were one and the same networks. So most television networks started life as radio networks, as it says there. They were the prime movers. Since AT&T owned the telephone lines, they were the first to establish their syndicate of radio stations. Since RCA at that time was the main producer of the hardware, the radios, they copied AT&T's system, but they had to lease their lines from AT&T, so they had to form a bond between themselves and AT&T. That's where the word affiliates started to come from, and we of course now have affiliated stations that affiliate with the major networks. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So NBC, owned by RCA, was the first network to come about. You see the evolution of their logo there in 1926. Wasn't long after that when Paley started CBS, the second network, in 1927. But the invention of electronic television didn't come along until a little bit later. Philip Farnsworth is credited with inventing the first tube dissector, based on the same principles as Nipkow, but in the form of electronics. So Philip Taylor Farnsworth is also a name you should remember. He came up with the first camera tube, and he transmitted his first images on September 7th, 1927. As I said, Sarnoff, who owned RCA, was the president of RCA and started RCA. He was very influential because radio had had a good 15 to 20 years to get started, to build his empire. He was known as a radio magnate and an electronics magnate. 1931, he says to Farnsworth, "I want to buy that little device you just invented." That would go naturally with my radio network, with my radio production. So he offered him $100,000, which in 1931 was millions, to us in today's dollars. So $100,000. He wanted him to come work for RCA. If you know anything about companies like RCA, or what later became David Sarnoff Research Facilities, when you go to work for them, you enter into an agreement saying that everything you do, everything you create, belongs to the company. So in other words, he wanted Sarnoff to come work for him. He wanted Farnsworth to come work for him, and he wanted to take his technology and own it himself. Farnsworth refused, of course. RCA later sued Farnsworth, claiming he had used some of their patents. So if you're ever on the internet searching around and you see all this stuff we talk about now about patent trolls and copyright trolls, and companies suing other companies over patents. Apple's always suing Samsung, Samsung suing Microsoft, etc., etc. They're always suing each other over patent infringement. This is not something new. It's something that's been going on for over 100 years. So RCA sues Farnsworth, claiming they had prior patents. After years of litigation, years of Farnsworth saying no, ultimately RCA succumbed to his demands, and he licensed the technology to them in 1939. So at that time, we get the first U.S. produced television set, and it showcased at the World's Fair in 1939. And that was, of course, built by Sarnoff at RCA Victor. And there's an image of the first television set that was mass produced. If you are asked a question on the test about which television was the first mass-produced television, your answer is going to be RCA, not Baird. Even though Baird had the first produced television, the first one to really mass-produce it commercially was RCA. And they made a name for themselves producing these televisions, as we'll soon see. So that is your answer. But be aware that when you talk about the history of television in general, there are several people who can lay claim to that title. But I want you to remember RCA for the most part. Of course, this is the logo, Nipper the dog. You've probably seen this. You probably didn't know his name was Nipper. At the time, they would say he listens to his master's voice through the phonograph there. So the first license from the FCC was issued shortly after that in 1941. When people started broadcasting television, the federal government, of course, says, well, I don't know that you can do that without our permission. I mean, the primary purpose, of course, is taxation. They want to tax the airways. They want to get some revenue from that. So they built the FCC, and this is when the FCC started regulating television, 1941. This was followed by Farnsworth Philco Station in Philadelphia. The FCC soon adopted a standard, which is called the NTSC standard, which we still use today. It's changed, of course, over the years. They started that in 1941, and that called for 525 lines of resolution. A little bit more sharp than the 18 to 50 lines of resolution that had been in the Baird, that had been in the early models. Had to be 30 frames per second, had to be interlaced, had to be 60 fields per second, and had to have sound carried on a certain frequency modulation. So by 1946, we have the three majors, CBS, NBC, ABC, or NBC. 1947, this set sold 170,000 units. Now again, don't think in today's terms. 170,000 wouldn't be even a blip on our scope in today's society. But in 1947, 170,000 units of anything was going to make whoever owned the company a millionaire. By 1949, there were over 1 million television sets in homes in the U.S. Now, contemplate that for a minute. 1 million sets. I don't know what the population was in 1947 of the United States, but now it's 330 some odd million. But 1 million sets sold in 1947, a very significant number. It's what made RCA who they are. It's what made NBC who they are. By 1950, it had reached a market saturation of around 10 million. So you see the exponential growth of television in that 3 to 4 year period from 170,000 to over 10 million. First commercial television, color television set was sold in 1953, although at the time most people still hung on to their black and whites because color televisions were 10 times the cost of a black and white, much like new technology today. At first, it's the wealthy trendsetters who buy them and get them. Color television sets took a little bit longer to saturate the market. Of course, today, 98% of all households own a television set. You can be dirt poor in the middle of Kentucky. And I've been driving through the back roads of Kentucky, and you see satellite dishes sitting out next to homes that are moderate, to say the least. Why is that? Because we adopted this technology wholeheartedly. It is a technology which affects our lives. So 98% own at least one, probably more than one, television set. Of course, the FCC is involved with this as well. They established the world's first monochrome compatible color television standard in December of 1953, shortly thereafter the release. These were the early RCA color televisions. Since they were the prime mover, they were the ones who sold both the end product that the consumer bought and the products used to produce the stream. And then, of course, they owned the network that distributed the stream. So RCA built these television cameras, and these are the ones that were used in probably the first decade of television production. First color transmission occurred on January 1, 1954, and that was of the Rose Bowl Parade in California. And of course, that's a tradition that most of you probably grew up watching, if you're anything like my family, and it's still being broadcast today. It's been broadcast continually. So as with radio in the U.S., television network, particularly in the early years, didn't offer a full day of broadcasting. There were reasons for that. They didn't have the content. Even the radio programs would go off the air at midnight, so would the television sets. You guys don't remember this, I'm sure, but at midnight, usually, you'd see the American flag, they'd play the national anthem, and the set would go blank. And you'd have that white fuzz that you see on Poltergeist or other movies. So your programming would go off because they didn't have the programming to keep it going. So because of this drought, local stations would produce local programming. You would have local news shows, which would be fed into the programming schedule. So for example, you would have your local news at 5 o'clock, and you would have your network news 30 minutes later. So that's where we get into the careers of people like Walter Cronkite, people who were national stars, national news people, who would defer to the local schedules. So they needed the network feeds to supplement their schedule. So everybody relied on everybody else for content. In the early years, most of this was live. You've probably seen YouTube videos of people breaking in live to talk about something. Most of these sitcoms were done live. Some still are. Most are filmed these days, filmed before a live studio audience, whereas back then they were live. When you see an I Love Lucy episode, think about that. She was doing this all spontaneously, live, in front of an audience, being filmed at the same time. There was no alternative. We didn't have, at the early stages, any way to record television and then retransmit it. So programming consisted of live broadcasts. Sometimes you would have variety shows, as I said, news shows, quiz shows, game shows, things like that. I Love Lucy, one of the very first shows, as I indicated, was based, of course, on the radio show. And because the television industry grew up out of the radio industry, many of these shows were forced to fit into the television format. Some did better than others, but the I Love Lucy show, of course, one of the most popular ones, it was based on the radio show My Favorite Husband. Variety shows were very popular at that time. You had things like the Ed Sullivan Show, where Ed was kind of the ringleader. He would introduce various acts into the show. He would have his little band. All of this was done live while people were watching. And usually, well, not usually, all the time back then, everybody tuned in at the same time because it was live. If it was scheduled for 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening and you missed it, you didn't get to see it. We didn't have TiVo. We didn't have recording of any kind, so you missed it. So everybody tuned in at the same time. So everybody was sitting in front of their television sets at the same time to watch Ed introduce the Beatles, for example. So that was a big part of their programming. They would bring in, of course, musicians, jugglers, anything you would see in a live show. Stand-up comedians, very popular at the time. So as I said earlier, as I indicated, they were forcing these radio shows into the programming of the television. They were transitioning those shows from a radio format to a television format. Some of them worked better than others. They would take vaudeville acts, force those into a television format. Early on, there was very little dramatic program, but that, of course, started to evolve as well. First television western, or drama, was Hopalong Cassidy, which appeared in 1949, again, originally as a radio program. When they did start to get into dramatic programming, soap operas were very popular. At that time, of course, most women in the household were home, taking care of the kids, cleaning, doing whatever women did in the 1950s. So soap operas became very popular. Dramas related to love stories and things that would attract what would be their live audience at the time. So short-form dramatic programs. Gunsmoke is one of the early forms of these. Gunsmoke ran as a television program from 1955 to 1975. It ran as a radio program for about 10 years prior to that. So that gives it one of the longest primetime titles of all time. I'm not sure if it still holds that title or not. There may have been some show to overtake it of recent years. So many of the classic television programs started out as these radio shows. Because there was a vacuum in those programming, the television stations would also try to obtain film licensing. So they would try to go out and go to the movie industry and say, okay, we need to license your film to show it on our network. And that became very big. You would have a network premiere of a particular movie, much like you do now. Of course, now you have the cable release, you have the CD release or DVD release, and then ultimately the free television network release. But in those days, network was all there was. So a network premiere meant a lot more than it does now. So television was aired over these three major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. And for years, that's all we had. We had the three stations, nothing more. Local affiliates, again, would carry their local programming, but they would always defer to the national. These three majors had affiliate agreements with all of the local stations. So through that, they developed their network. Through AT&T's phone lines, through RCA's radio syndicate, they developed the concept of the affiliate, where you had the mothership with mothership programming that would feed all of these affiliates programming. And then the locals could insert their own programming wherever they wanted, but they would defer to the mothership, whenever there was a conflict. So if there was a major news story breaking, like John F. Kennedy being shot, the networks would break into the local programming, interrupt it, and transmit to all their affiliates. This gave the major networks a lot of power in terms of advertising, because they could guarantee an advertiser 1 million television sets. And if you can guarantee somebody they're going to be seen by 1 million people, that's a very valuable commodity, isn't it? And that's what Sarnoff was going for all along. So, business was based on adding video to the radio model in order to increase advertising. Radio came along because of advertisers. The Hopalong Cassidy show, a lot of these shows were sponsored by one advertiser. Maybe it was Ovaltine. Maybe it was Martha White, for example, who sponsored the Grand Ole Opry when it was growing up, as you all probably know. So you had one sponsor. So this concept of sponsorship of a program continued on through television. We have people like the Ford Television Theater, the Kraft Television Network. So television, like radio, existed to sell advertising. Whereas the movie industry, as we'll see a little bit later, totally different. It exists. I mean, now, of course, you have product placement and all kinds of cooperative advertising. They've learned their lesson. But at the time, they existed to sell tickets to a theater. We produce a product that is distributed in our proprietary theaters, so we sell movie tickets. That's how the movie industry grew up. Television industry, unlike that, didn't have people coming to a theater to buy, so they had to make their money some other way, and that was by selling airtime or selling spots like the Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, one of my favorite shows growing up. So they would recruit these sponsors. As a result, these sponsors would end up with a great deal of power over the programming. So one of the ways they could guarantee this is because of that affiliate network that they developed, which was called owned and operated television stations. So all the ones that were owned and operated, they had total control of as the mothership, and they covered about 85 to 90% of the television market. Pretty huge numbers even today. So local television affiliates had some options as to whether or not to carry the network programming, but those that were owned and operated carried only what was offered by the networks. So, as I said, the television sponsors, like Mutual of Omaha, had great control over what was put into the television show. They were paying for it. So as a result, they had the right to say, you're going to make Fred Flintstone and Wilma smoke one of our cigarettes. So in early Fred Flintstone cartoons, you would often see them smoking in a little commercial right before the cartoon. It took us a while to realize that probably wasn't a good thing to encourage kids who would be watching these cartoons to want to smoke, but nonetheless, they had the power to do that, and they did it. So they would insist that their products be placed in the shows. So you start to see the first evidence of product placement really early on. Again, with the contrast between the movie industry and the television industry, those who had grown up as stars in the television world, or in the in the movie world, kind of looked down on the television. But those that had grown up in the radio world took to it really well, like Lucy Ball, who we looked at before, like Ozzie and Harriet, like the Jack Benny Show, like Jackie Gleason. I tried to get all those sound effects out of there, but I missed one. So early television was all done in the studio, in the set, the same sets that where you would have the national news broadcast would be rolled out, wheeled out. This desk would be rolled out. There would be a set brought in from the other side. It's very much like live theater in that regard. But that became, of course, impractical very quickly. As they started to get into the dramatic programming, more and more things had to be moved. So they started looking to build production studios, trying to figure out where to build. Location production was very limited because of the cost of transporting these huge monsters. unlike the early video equipment, these were not, the television cameras were not so portable. So they had to find places where the weather was cooperative, like, as I said, California, but also like Florida, islands where Gilligan's Island was filmed. So if they could find a compatible spot, they would use outside sets. But a natural progression in this evolution, since the motion picture industry already had production facilities in California, was that they became a stepchild of the movie industry. So they began to compete for the space or lease the space from movie production houses. NBC, of course, had huge facilities in New York. They were sometimes leased from the movie industry, which was also very large in New York. So movie picture studios rented their space to television producers as an added source of income. But because of this fact that the movie people had grown up in their industry, the television industry had evolved from radio, the television people were a little bit of a snob when it came to television. They looked down upon this as a lesser art form, kind of like classical musicians when pop music started coming around. It was a lesser art form in some way. So those actors wouldn't act on television. It was considered a sign of weakness or considered something that would hurt your career. So it took a number of years before that attitude evolved and people started to recognize that there was a lot of money in television. It wasn't going away. There was a huge audience. Rather than acting or showing your film in front of hundreds at a time, you could instantly show your film to millions of people. That was a very powerful thing. So again, the advertisers began to flock to the television, and when that happens, actors will soon follow. Where the money goes, so goes the people, generally. So as television grew, motion picture producers began to see television as an additional outlet and a very lucrative outlet. One of the very first pioneers in this regard was Gene Roddenberry. You may not know that name, but you certainly know that show, Star Trek, which became a national phenomenon as a result of the fact that Roddenberry saw movie production or longer shows produced specifically for television as a very lucrative outlet. Soon, sponsors began to realize that television was a very powerful medium. So people like Hallmark began to produce movies and even produce their own movie channel once cable came into the picture in the 90s. Sorry, cable came in the 80s. The demand for television program grew, and as it grew, it produced more studios, more production, more and more actors were attracted to it. It became a weekly routine for them. It was more like a job. Rather than going to a movie set in some strange state or maybe even a different country, the actors saw it as a normal routine. This is a 9-to-5 job. I can get up, go to the studio, work on the television program, then I can go home and have dinner with my family. That's something that a lot of actors at that point in time didn't have. They didn't have regular pay. They didn't have a weekly salary or a salary based on the number of episodes. It was based on a movie, and if you didn't have a movie going on, you didn't have any pay. So, as you can see here, actors like Jack Klugman made an art form of this. He was at first a stage actor, and then he became one of the most well-known television actors of the time. So gradually it became more acceptable to the television people. So two of the key differences in television production and motion picture production was that television production had smaller budgets and money was raised from sponsors or networks who would then sell that time to advertisers. And the motion picture industry world, it still is true that you have to get outside funding. You can get it from production houses and distribution companies, but somehow you have to raise the funding, as we'll talk about later, to produce your movie. Here, with television, it goes through a whole channel of approvals, but then once it's approved, the money is there, and it comes in through the advertisers. You still have to do a little selling, but it's a little bit more instantaneous. Now, television programs, as you know, also have an afterlife. Some movies can develop this phenomenon a little bit, but not like the syndicates or the syndication of television programming. Once you've produced a series of television shows, you can then syndicate them or license them to other networks. And once cable came along, that market grew exponentially. So then you could license them to cable networks who also need programming. So you license your MASH program to 50 different people, and all of a sudden it's showing everywhere in reruns, they were called. So the afterlife of miniseries, like Seinfeld, for example, have been careers for many actors and still bring in millions of dollars for them in their residual income. So this developed a cottage industry of production syndicates, and they would produce or license syndicated programs from various sources. One of the very first of these was the syndicator's Ziff television production, which produced classics like The Adventures of Superman and Mr. Ed, specifically for the purpose of syndication. They're still one of the largest syndicators. Now, we talked a lot about U.S. television. We haven't talked much about foreign. U.S. is ad-based, primarily, but much of the world is more like cable. Their local program networks came up through a system of government-funded networks. So in Europe, you might have to pay $20-30 for television for a year. And that's a tax, which is then given to the television networks to produce the programming. In France, for example, families pay 116 francs, or approximately $156 per year. So that's how television is funded in other countries. All right, any questions about television? All right, we will talk about cyberspace on Friday. As I said, no test on Monday. It's going to be moved to either Wednesday or Friday of next week, so that you don't have to worry about it over this weekend. And I will tell you more about what it covers on Monday. Okay? I will see you guys Friday.